Hope you had a nice first day, right? So, today we are going to talk about water ecosystem interactions, followed by a session on soil and plant soil, plant and water interactions, and finally we will talk about how do we develop a, or what is the process behind developing a process based hydrological model with an introduction to SWAT, and we'll go on with a hands-on session. Okay, so that is the overall plan. Now, coming to your water ecosystem interactions, we take forward from where we were yesterday. What were the three fundamental principles of ecohydrology? You can refer to the book, right? What are the three fundamental principles? That is, you can manipulate hydrological cycle to control biological processes. The second one, we can manipulate biological processes to control hydrological cycle. And the third one, develop sustainable solutions, right? Now, that is what we are going to look at least partially, when we talk about how this interaction happens. When we say that we can manipulate, we also need to understand the interactions between these aspects, right? How does this your biological system or hydrological system affect or interact with the water? Okay, so coming to the learning outcomes. So, at the end of this lecture, what we expect you to know is to understand the interaction between vegetation and hydrological process, something we discussed briefly in the yesterday when we were discussing about the hydrological process, but little bit more in depth into that. And how ecosystems affect the water cycle in both in terms of water quantity and water quality, and influence of land use changes on water cycle. And I also will present one case study, one of the MTech thesis which has worked partially on this. It was basically the impact of climate and land use change on the hydrology, right? So, coming to interaction between water and ecosystem, right? You have different ecosystems. You have the aquatic ecosystem, then you have nutrients, habitat, then you have humans, that is soil organisms, bacteria. So, all these ecosystems interact with water in one way or other. And when we are talking in terms of water and ecosystem interactions, our focus is mostly on the agro systems, agricultural based systems, right, or forested based systems, right. So, to develop any solutions, we must have a understanding of the functionings of Earth's hydrological and ecological systems and how they interact, right. So, your ecosystems play a pivotal role in shaping water cycles. We discussed this, like if you change the vegetation, there may have some significant effect on the evaporation or evapotranspiration, and it will have certain effects, right. So, there are some natural changes over a period of time. There are some natural changes that occur in your water cycle and the ecosystem as such. But then in addition to that, there will be some anthropogenic changes, which are basically changes in land use and then some human interventions such as hydraulic structures. Now, usually these interactions impact water availability, water quality, and distribution across the landscape. So, it is also the spatial distribution with change. Okay. So, for example, you may have done something at a particular location, and that effect may have at completely different location, right. So, for example, a completely change in cropping pattern in Telangana may be affecting precipitation in Maharashtra or Chhattisgarh, right, or Madhya Pradesh. So, you never know how these changes are, or rather we need to understand how changes at different spatial scales are occurring because of changes in or because of human activities, right. And this is a dynamic feedback. Hydrological cycle is always a dynamic feedback. That is, whatever you are changing on land is getting affected in the atmosphere, and then it is coming back in a different way, right. So, coming to ecosystem water interactions, we are primarily focusing on two things. One is influence of vegetation. How is your vegetation affecting your transpiration, interception, infiltration? What happens when you are having forests or grasslands which can act as a buffer, right, for your floods and droughts? and also the soil moisture dynamics. How does your soil moisture dynamics, which is the soil storage, which is the primary storage in your catchment. So how does it change by changing of ecosystems, right? Sometimes vegetation enhances the retained and soil moisture, and because of these, how your eco-hydrological feedbacks come. There is the interaction between vegetation and soil moisture, and as well as with the water cycle. Vegetation may increase the soil moisture, and at the same time it will also extract in the form of transpiration, sometimes from the deeper levels. But because of presence of vegetation, your soil moisture also increases, right? And because there is an increase in soil moisture and vegetation, there may be an enhanced evapotranspiration, which may change the microclimate and lead to more precipitation. Okay. So in addition to that, land use changes, we briefly discussed about how urbanization and how loss of vegetation affects the atmosphere or the hydrological cycle, and ecosystem services, quality and quantity of regulation. We are discussing ecosystem services separately in an individual lecture, but just to briefly introduce you here. Now coming to the first aspect, the influence of vegetation on hydrological process. We have seen this yesterday. Evaporation and transpiration is what combined to evapotranspiration. Yes. So you have the evapotranspiration that is occurring because of the vegetation. Now this vegetation affects the hydrological cycle in different ways. First, when there is a vegetation, depending upon the type of vegetation, depending upon the density, your rainfall and runoff process is affected. When the rain comes to the earth's surface, this vegetation or trees, shrubs, grasses, they intercept this rainfall. So what happens when they intercept? There is something called as canopy storage. All trees and all plants after a rain will hold some water in their branches, leaves, stems, right? You would have seen, probably if you just shake a tree immediately after a rain, lot of water comes down. Yes, that is what we call as interception storage. Now this interception storage also contributes to the evaporative demand. So when I say evaporative demand, it is primarily potential evapotranspiration. Your potential evapotranspiration is a function of only climate factors, right? What is the maximum evapotranspiration that can occur because of the climatic factors, that is because of temperature, wind speed, relative humidity, right? So if the evaporative demand at a particular location can be met from these interception storage, then the evaporation from the soil and transpiration losses will be relatively less. Okay. So in addition to the intercepting the rain, whatever the rain that gets intercepted, instead of directly falling on the surface, it slowly trickles down along the river, along the tree, or along the plant, and percolates into the, or gets added into soil moisture, right? So it's a slow process. So in that way, it also helps in reducing the soil erosion. Your erosion is caused because primarily the initiation gets happened because of splash erosion. When the rain drop hits, it generally has a higher velocity with higher kinetic energy. That kinetic energy gets transferred to the soil particles, and it helps in transportation. So it also helps in reducing the soil erosion. In addition, infiltration, you have more infiltration, so more retention of soil moisture, you have more soil moisture, it will help the tree to grow. Higher soil moisture also helps your tree to grow or have or retain the moisture for a longer time, so that the plant can utilize it at a later time. Okay. Now because of this changes in your evaporation, evapotranspiration, and increased soil moisture, there will be an effect on the microclimate. Okay, I have it in my next slide. But in addition to that, you will have higher groundwater recharge, since the water that is percolating is slow, it will have more time to percolate, and the runoff patterns. The runoff, surface runoff gets reduced, or surface runoff, initially when the surface runoff gets generated, it goes as an overland flow. A thin sheet of water flowing across the land surface. Now that thin sheet of water, when it gets an obstruction in form of some vegetation, the velocity reduces. Once the velocity reduces, it gets more time to percolate into the soil and further percolate into the groundwater. Okay. Now, with the changes in your vegetation or shifts in plant growth cycle. Now, sometimes these shifts can be natural. You know that your monsoon, or sometimes it is a above average, below average monsoon. That is a continuous cyclic process because of some global circulation that is happening, right. Now, because of that there may be some shifts in your planting dates or some shifts in your vegetation types. Now, because of that there may be have an effect on this feedback or eco-hydrological feedback that is present. Okay. In addition to that, density and species, you are changing the cropping type, so and composition can disrupt these processes. So, any vegetation, when I say a canopy which can hold water compared to a less denser canopy, it will not hold be much water and it will allow water to directly interact with the soil. Okay. Now, here we have a dense slide or whatever I was telling now. So, if you see the first image here, so here we have two components, or we can put a two different aspects. One where you have a dense vegetation cover, let us say a forest, and second one a little dense vegetation cover with mostly open land with some anthropogenic activities or human activities taking place. Now, the figure, this figure you see here, there is some precipitation that is coming, there is some gets intercepted, some goes as runoff, right, some goes as soil moisture, but because of the presence of plants and dense canopy cover, the evapotranspiration is also high. That means, whatever is coming, much of it is going back, and which creates a input output balance. The atmospheric transport, whatever is coming, getting it back to the atmosphere, and it forms a recycled rainfall. In addition to that, surface runoff is less. Once surface runoff becomes less, it helps in reducing the soil erosion, right. It also helps in deeper groundwater recharge, because the water flow is much more slower, it helps in more percolation, right. Now, if you see this figure onto the right, you see that it is little less dense vegetation, some activity, some agriculture is happening, you are receiving the same amount of rainfall, but this rainfall, the amount of evapotranspiration that is going is significantly less. That is, what the atmosphere is getting back is significantly lesser than this particular system. In addition to that, because the land is open, there is a increased runoff, increased flow to the soil and soil erosion, and the output to the atmosphere, atmospheric transport is much less compared to input. So, in this process you need, for the rain to occur again here, you need the moisture coming from some other location. Much of our moisture comes from the oceans, your southwest monsoon, much of the moisture is coming through the oceans, and that is where you receive the rain. But then many of the microclimate, micro locations, you will have this kind of feedback system which will help in having the rainfall. So, this is with different vegetation types. Now, if you come to different crops, you have different crops here. Now, let us say a crop which starts in May and ends in September. Most of the US systems are like that, at least the Midwest, where you have a single crop. Ours starts somewhere in June or July and ends in October, November, and then we have a second crop. But then this reference evapotranspiration is the maximum evapotranspiration that can occur because of the climatic conditions, right, because of the temperature, because of the relative humidity. Now, depending upon the crop type, only some part of the evapotranspiration may be occurring, or it is possible that it may be little close to the maximum, right. So, obviously, your actual evapotranspiration cannot be higher than potential evapotranspiration, but depending upon the crop type, your evapotranspiration will change, or the amount of water that is being taken out changes, right. So, for example, paddy is a very water intensive crop. You want the soil to always to be saturated, right. We always said that for paddy to grow, there should be a standing water. It is not necessary to have a standing water. It is just that you should have the soil to be saturated, but if there is a standing water, it helps in growth because it helps in photosynthesis a little bit faster, right? But for it is important for the paddy to have only saturated conditions. Now, when the saturated soil conditions, the water will go. Now, compared to that, if you are growing something like maize, it is not saturated conditions. So, your evapotranspiration will be much less as compared to what a paddy might have, and similarly any other crop. Okay? And if you want to grow some legumes, they require much less water as compared to a plant. So, if you are changing the cropping pattern, it will create a dynamic loop which gets changed, right. So, when we have a shifts in cropping pattern, it affects the water requirement, and at the same time it affects this feedback loop that is happening, right. And then depending upon the density of vegetation, there is something called as hydraulic resistance. So, if you have these vegetations in water bodies such as wetlands or in streams, vegetated waterways, which helps us in reducing the erosion. If you have a less dense, the water will flow, the trapping of sediment particles will be much less, right, and the infiltration or percolation will also be relatively less. However, on the other hand, if you have little dense vegetation, there will be some standing water, trapping of sediment will be more, but then it will have more infiltration. But again, because of increased water availability, you may get different pests, right, different organisms that start habitating, right. So, it's all a dynamic system. Now, when it comes to soil moisture dynamics, your vegetation helps the soil moisture and soil moisture helps the vegetation. It's both ways. Now, how does the vegetation help the soil moisture? One way, what I have told, it slows down the movement of water, so that it allows the water to infiltrate into the soil matrix and percolate deeper. In addition to that, the presence of roots creates a soil structure that is conducive for the water to flow. It creates more interconnected pore spaces, and what we call as a good structured soil, a well structured soil, where it is interconnected. So, water that comes in goes to the pore spaces and tries to fill up the voids. So, in addition to this thing, the creating good structured soil, vegetation also helps in keeping the surface pores unclogged. Now, what happens when there is a rainfall on a bare soil is, the raindrop will come, hit, it will have some velocity, some kinetic energy which gets transferred to the soil particles. Now, as the soil particles get dispatched, it is possible that it will clog the surface pores. Now, once it clogs the surface pores, the ability to infiltrate also reduces. Now, not only that, further if it gets compacted, the vegetation will also not come out. I don't know how many of you have noticed, if you walk, if some grassed way is there and people keep walking, a path gets developed where there is no vegetation. That is because of compaction. Constant walking, it leads to compaction, thus resulting in no infiltration, and the vegetation also cannot come out because of the compacted top surface soil. Now, whatever during the rain, because of the water from the adjoining areas comes and it becomes very muddy, right, and all that aspect. But that is what will happen in a degraded soil, right. If you don't have vegetation, the chances of getting compacted is more, right. Now, once you have the soil moisture here, because of more good structured soil, it aids the plant to grow. So, you have a plant, it covers the surface, right. So, the solar radiation will also be intercepted, it will be much cooler. So, even evaporation from the soil will be less. What it will help is, it will help the soil to retain the moisture for a much longer time as compared to what it would have if it was completely exposed to atmosphere. So, in that process, the plant has much longer duration to extract water from the surface, right, as compared to a much deeper soils. So, your roots grow deep primarily to extract the water. Whenever the water is less, they start growing deep. Okay. So, recently we went to a here Mulugu. Okay. There was a specific, very specific climatic event. A stretch of around 500 meters, because of a wind jet, trees fell in the forest, Mulugu forest. It was there in the news. So, all the trees fell in one direction. It was a very, very peculiar incident, and people wanted to know what has happened. So, a climatic event happened and a jet stream moved through that particular space. Now, most of the trees were having, which we were expecting to have a deep roots, and they were old. Some were even more than 100, 150 years old trees. Instead of having deep roots, most of them were having shallow roots. They were able to extract whatever nutrients or moisture from the soil at a shallow level, thus their roots levels are very shallow. Okay. So, it was basically trees on this side, nothing happened, here nothing happened, in between there is a complete destruction with only trees falling onto one side. Okay. So, that root system helps in both ways. Okay. So, the interaction between soil moisture and vegetation types, including the respect to root structures and water uptake capacities, are fundamental in shaping how ecosystems respond to water availability and fluctuations in moisture levels. How your moisture level, soil moisture levels changes, or how your this thing affects the ecosystem, right? And that is where. So, you have a well structured soil because of presence of the vegetation, which creates pore spaces for the water to percolate and infiltrate. Whereas, on the other hand, you have a non-vegetated soil where, because of the compaction on the surface, the infiltration will also be much less. Now, coming to the eco-hydrological feedbacks. So, all this system, whatever is getting generated, will have a feedback, right. So, the interaction between vegetation and soil moisture create a eco-hydrological feedbacks, where changes in one aspect such as vegetation, growth or soil moisture affect the other component of the water cycle, right. You have seen in the previous figures how changes in one is causing the change in the other aspect, right. So, your vegetation helps stabilize soil, prevents erosion. It prevents erosion means even the nutrient transport will be less. Nitrogen, phosphorus, whatever the nutrients are there, that will also be less, and facilitates water movement through the root systems, ensuring that water flows efficiently across the landscape, right. And then usually in a healthy ecosystem, this feedback loop is largely positive. When I say positive, it means that the negative aspects of it is completely less. That is, vegetation supporting soil moisture retention and soil moisture supporting plant growth. Whereas, when the ecosystems are degraded because of the natural factors or anthropogenic factors, such as in desertification prone areas, these feedbacks are disrupted, leading to increased runoff, erosion and diminished water retention capacity. Okay. So, even the water availability, if your soil moisture is high, it is leading to more groundwater, your water availability, which gives to the streams finally your base flow. If your water levels are high, many of the streams, many of our perennial streams or peninsular streams are driven by base flow during the summer months. So, this increased soil moisture as well as the increased groundwater recharge helps in creating that flow, right. But then if that soil moisture gets reduced, groundwater recharge gets reduced, even the flow in many of your rivers are going to come down. Okay. Now, coming to the land use and water quality, one of the factors is urbanization, right. So, your urbanization, though it increases the runoff because of the more impervious land, it also affects the water quality. Now, how does it affect the water quality? Most of our urban areas are dirty. Yes, you walk around, even we are part of the problem, right. We throw something, we throw most of the waste onto the road without realizing that what it might cause, right. So, that waste or that heavy metals or that pollutants get washed out and goes into the drains. This is a drain where after a rain event, water is flowing and it goes to the drains, so which affects the water quality, right. In addition to that, we also release lot of our domestic waste, industrial waste into water bodies, into lakes, into running rivers, right. So, which causes lot of water quality issues. Okay. So, runoff can carry pollutants like heavy metals, chemicals and sediments into nearby rivers, lakes, streams, leading to a decline in water quality. So, first your dissolved oxygen gets reduced, and consequently other water quality parameters are also getting affected. Then you have, because of urbanization, much of your wetlands are getting affected, the removal of vegetation and wetlands, which once played an essential role in filtering the water. So, these wetlands, which were initially playing a role for filtering out the water body as well as controlling the flow of water, right. Much of these wetlands acted like a flood buffer zones. They were reducing the flooding impacts, are now not there, and resulting in more frequent flooding or more intense flooding in the urban areas, right. These kind of, we do not see these kind of lakes or wetlands anymore in majority of the cities, right. So, in addition to the flooding problem, they also act as natural filters, right. I think in the previous yesterday we said that they are kidneys of your watershed. So, absence of this, increase of this causes or increases our problems more. Okay. Agriculture, that is something that we require food security, but then application of fertilizers, where we have discussed this yesterday, we are applying more fertilizer than what is required, right, in the point to get more food productivity, more profit, right. You go and tell to a farmer, you should not apply this much fertilizer. I am pretty much sure it will take lot of convincing from your end for him to reduce it, right, because it is known that with increase in fertilizer, your productivity or yield is going to increase, right. So, but that increase is actually causing much of the eutrophication problem. So, it is the agriculture which is supposed to be a solution, or the fertilizer application which is supposed to be a solution for food security, is actually causing a problem for water security, right. And in that process, we are also moving to more changing the cropping pattern to have more profits, right. So, you have more rice is being grown, more sugar is being grown, because you get more profit out of it. In that process, your nutrient transport also changes, and that is what is leading to water quality and water this thing. In addition to water bodies, there is a nutrient leaching to the groundwater surface, subsurface flow. Sometimes your groundwater which we drink thinking that it is pure might be contaminated with the presence of these minerals. Okay. Now, coming to your ecosystem services and water regulation. So, any ecosystem that you have, any watershed system will provide some services. It can be regulatory services or it can be provisioning services. It providing a food is a service that it gives, right, which can be quantified, which can have an economic value associated to it, right. So, your vegetation, wetlands and forests play a crucial role in buffering the impacts of extreme weather events such as floods and droughts by enhancing soil moisture retention and reducing runoff. Okay. So, even if anyone is working on urban drainage system, there is some vegetated waterways or some what we call as sustainable urban drainage systems to be installed, rainwater harvesting structures or some way to increase the percolation. So, your vegetation, wetlands and forest, though they play a crucial role, we also must understand that it also have a feedback to your hydrological cycle, which may have certain effect at that particular location as well as some other location because of the spatial variation. Then you have ecosystems contribute to regulation of local humidity and precipitation patterns, further stabilizing the water cycle. So, not only humidity levels, your temperature levels. So, usually this NIT Warangal campus, because of it has relatively higher vegetation compared to the adjoining areas, the temperature is usually lower, at least 1 to 2 degrees lower than the outside. And most of the campuses, most of the educational campuses are like that. There will be a lot of vegetation, and because of the vegetation during the summer, you will be much more cooler. Okay? And similarly, if you go nearby a lake, it gets little bit more cooler, the humidity levels, because of presence of a water body, which leads to evaporation, and that process is basically a cooling process. Your wetlands, which are the kidneys of your watershed, in particular act as natural filters, trapping pollutants and improving water quality before it enters larger bodies of water. Okay. Now, across the globe, it's not only the problem of India, it's not only the problem of Telangana, but across the globe your vegetation patterns are shifting. One is, it is shifting due to anthropogenic activities, our humans. We have created a lift irrigation system, so more water availability. Telangana turned from a dryland agriculture to a more irrigated agriculture, producing lot of paddy. That's a human intervention. But apart from that, your climate change also causes changes in precipitation patterns. Climate change is also, there is some natural component to the climate change, right? Suddenly there is a variation in precipitation, a variation in when the monsoon is coming. That leads to changes in your vegetation type. One of the adaptation strategies for increasing crop productivity is changing the planting date. Instead of starting your crop, let's say from the mid of June, you start from 1st of July or mid of July, you may have a better yield. Now that changes your entire feedback in this process, right? So one of the solutions and the effect of vegetation patterns is climate change, right? So changing these vegetation patterns and human activities, we need to understand how these ecosystems regulate water availability, quality to ensure sustainable water resource management. Now why we are talking about all this is, when it changes the precipitation or water availability across your at different spatial scale, then it will have an effect on water availability at some other location, right? So apart from the surface runoff, if you see the hydrological cycle, the transport of moisture in the atmosphere level will have, whatever you are doing here will have some effect at some place else. At the same time, your groundwater is also like that. The groundwater at some location may have been dried up because the groundwater recharge at some other location was plugged. Your confined aquifers, where you have a specific recharge zone. In that recharge zone, if it has been converted from a forested land or agricultural land to, let's say, an urban area, you have plugged the recharge and it will reduce the groundwater availability at some other location upstream or downstream of it. Similarly, changes in your vegetation at this particular location will have certain effect on some other this thing. I think few years back there was one study in the US where they said, I think it was published in some journal, where they said that afforestation in one state, or the vegetation increase in one state, caused increase in precipitation in a completely different state which was almost hundreds of kilometers or hundreds of miles away from it, right? So in it, though surface runoff gets affected, the atmospheric circulation and groundwater, these things get affected, right? Many of your water bodies downstream, we are saying that lakes are drying up, right? Why the urban expansion is happening in the lakes? We say that lakes are drying up, so you can use it for water. But lakes are also probably drying up because we are cutting them the feeder channels. The feeder channels which were coming to those lakes earlier, some development has happened and we have cut off that movement of water into the lake, leading it to drying up. Now that lake is getting dried up, you start developing, and then some flood comes, there is no way for the water to go. Okay? So all these anthropogenic processes and the natural processes affect this water ecosystem interaction. Okay? Now coming to the interlink of climate, water and land use, they are interlinked. So again, a quite dense figure which we have is basically you have the land cover which interacts with climate, climate interacts with land cover and society, population. It has demands from both climate and land cover, and it gets affected by both. And obviously, the water resources is at the center of that, right? And this hydrological cycle interlinked with society, it will have a interaction between climate and land cover. Okay. So, we wanted to look at this, how does the changes in your climate and land use affect the water availability for a particular basin. So, we looked at one of my student, master student Indruja, who has done a work on assessment of synergistic and independent effects of climate and LULC changes in Brahmani and Baitarani basin, right, which now she is doing a PhD in IIT Kharagpur. Now, okay, this goes back to yesterday's talk on dam. So, when we were trying to delineate this Brahmani and Baitarani basin using SRTM dam, it always was cutting out some part of the basin. And so, after multiple trials and error, I think this delineation has come from Amsterdam, right. So, something that I have mentioned yesterday, that your dam will have its own inherent uncertainties which you need to consider while delineating a watershed. Okay. So, when we look at this particular basin, we realize that the climate and LULC changes are the two key drivers that affect the hydrological process as they are interrelated. There is a land use land cover change, as well as there is some climate change that is happening in this particular basin. Now, this basin extends over Orissa, Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, and agriculture is the major component. Around 52% is agriculture, with 2.95% is covered with with water. So, we wanted to look at three aspects of it. One is we wanted to understand how your historical and future climate change signals, a simple data analysis, climate signal analysis over the catchment, and we also wanted to analyze the historical and future LULC changes. Then we wanted to use SWAT model to understand how this climate and land use land cover changes are affecting the stream flow, right, basically the water availability. So, this is the overall methodology. We analyzed the climate change scenarios, we took the historic period, computed some climate change indices, ETCCDI indices, did slope test, trend analysis, and also analyzed with the stream flow correlation with the stream flow, how does increase or decrease in this climate indices is affecting the stream flow. For the LULC, we had the historical LULC, some historical decadal maps were available, some maps we have created using the Landsat images. Then we predicted the future LULC using machine learning algorithms, and then LULC change detection, we given the climate data and the LULC data to the SWAT model and assess the isolated and combined impacts of climate and LULC changes. So, coming to the first part, where we try to understand how your precipitation and temperature is varying, we took the IMD data from 1901 to 2018, the gridded IMD data at 0.25 degree, precipitation and maximum minimum temperature. What we observed was your precipitation had a decreasing trend. Most of the basin had a decreasing trend. The precipitation is decreasing. Some locations it was significant, other locations it was insignificant, but majority of the basin had a decreasing trend. Coming to the maximum and minimum temperature had a significant increasing trend in the entire basin, whereas minimum temperature had a significant decreasing trend in the entire basin. That means the diurnal temperature difference, the maximum and minimum at a particular day is increasing over a period of time, right? And that difference affects your evaporation process, evaporation or evapotranspiration process, because it will have a differences in your relative humidity levels and how much the water can be extracted. Now, coming to other indices, we have computed 15 indices. This is your diurnal temperature range, which is bound to increase because maximum is increasing and minimum is decreasing. Then mean of maximum temperature, mean of minimum temperature, 10 percentile of maximum temperature, 90th percentile of maximum temperature, 10 percentile of minimum temperature, 90th percentile of minimum temperature, wet days, summer days, heat wave, then total precipitation, rainy days, dry days, then you have maximum 1 day precipitation and 95th percentile. So, we try to analyze the trends across the basin, right, how these indices, climate indices are affecting or showing it, right. So, The indices which were related to maximum temperature had significant increase primarily in the southern part of the basin, and minimum temperature related indices had a significant decrease in northwestern part of the basin, right here. Now coming to the precipitation related indices, the significant decrease basically was observed in northern basin, and grids showing increase summer days were also having increased total precipitation and 95th percentile. So what we realized was, although the decrease in precipitation was not much, your number of rainy days were decreasing. That means you are receiving more or less similar amount of rainfall at an annual scale, but in less number of days. Now this less number of days is what you want to conserve the water and utilize it for the entire year, right. From the Indian perspective, we are more focused on the water availability, primarily because we receive rainfall only in 4 months during the monsoon, primary rainfall, and the northeast monsoon, and remaining year throughout the year we are dry. So you need to have that water stored to be utilized for the across the year, right. So this is something that we had observed, that your number of rainy days are reducing, so you will have same amount of rainfall but in shorter duration. So you need to develop some management strategies for that. Now coming to the future period, you have taken one of the GCMs, bias corrected downscale, and did the analysis. I am not going in deep, but in general your extremes were increasing, your maximum temperature, there is an increasing temperature trend in the basin with variations in spatial distribution. The rate of increase in future time period is observed to be higher than that of historical period, and generally the precipitation indices show significant increase in rainfall over some parts of the basin. So your GCM studies show that there is maybe increase in your precipitation, right, which is contravening to what we have observed historically. Historically the precipitation was decreasing, but in the future period it was shown that some parts of the basin the precipitation is increasing. Now increasing rainfall has resulted in insignificant decrease in dry days. Now one of the components here is most of your GCMs which have been projected assume certain feedback. They are not having a feedback, actual feedback that is happening in the field. Based on some conditions present now, they are projecting for the future. So let us say in between you have changed some vegetation or some cropping pattern, that feedback is not taken care by GCM, and that is something that we need to understand while doing climate change studies. Okay, it is not like whatever the GCMs are telling it may happen, but if the changes of it should come back into that, and there are some models to take care of that. Some models do have the ability to consider this feedback. Now coming to the second part, that is LULC change detection. We had 3 decadal maps available to us from the NASA, 1985, 95 and 2005. The recent maps 2007, 14 and 21, we used Landsat images and Google Earth Engine to classify into 4 classes. We are not going specific into different class of agriculture, but forest agriculture built up an area. So among this, your built up land, which was around 657 square kilometers, increased to 4,295 square kilometers in 2021, which was almost a jump of 500% in the basin. Your forest declined close to 20% in all the time steps, but the water bodies are the ones which declined the most. Almost there was a 50% decrease in the water bodies in your land use land cover in this particular basin, right. And that decrease, as I said, might be because of cutting out of the feeder channels to your lakes, and also because of the natural changes in your precipitation. We saw that precipitation was decreasing over a period of time, right. Now your precipitation, when you had a decreasing trend, it is possible some of the water bodies were not getting filled up. But then if these water bodies which were now getting dried up or getting reduced has been converted to another land use, in the future you have this increasing precipitation. Now that increasing precipitation, the water that is coming in, it will have no place to go, right. Okay. So we analyzed how this is changing, and using the machine learning algorithms of ANN and logistic regression. It has a plugin in QGIS, MOLUSCE. We projected the land use for in the future from 28, 35, 56 and up to 2070. In general, most of our predictions showed that the built up is increasing. close to another 100% or 125% compared to 2015. You consider 2014 as the baseline. Agriculture is more or less constant, water is reducing further, right, and forest is also reducing, right. Only thing is agriculture is more or less constant. So, while projecting this or while mapping this, we have considered different factors, we have considered various socio-economic factors as well. I am not presenting that here, right. So, it is not just based on the historical maps, but in addition to the historical maps, we have considered other socio-economic factors which helped us in predicting this particular land use, right, to have it a little bit more accurate aspect of it. Now, coming to the third part, you have analyzed that land use is changing, you have analyzed that climate is changing, but how does it affect the stream flow? So, we use SWAT model, right, we have taken the data, set up the SWAT model, calibrated it, validated it, and then run it. But to run it, we created different scenarios. We created a decadal climate and land use. The first one 1981 to 1990, the first set climate, we had a land use map of 1985, 1991 to 2000, that is 95 land use map, 2001 to 2010, another climate, and 2005 land use map, 2011 to 17 and 14 was this is for the historical period. Now, when you have this, it is possible to have different combinations, and that combinations is what we created here. C1L1, C2L1, that means climate for the second period and land use for the first period. C3L1, climate for the third period and land use for the first period, and C4L1 is climate for the fourth period and land use for the first period. Similarly, you keep the climate constant and change the land uses in your SWAT model, and this diagonal element is what we considered as the baseline, that is C1L1, C2L2, C3L3 and C4L4. So, these green cells indicate the effect due to climate change, and these yellow cells are basically, if you analyze the difference between these cells and the baseline period, you can quantify what is the impact of LULC on the basin, right. So, basically the changes in stream flow are assessed by considering all the 12 different scenarios, right. So, the scenarios were designed such that climate in each decade was forced through the model for each land use. Okay. So, we have calibrated and validated the model. Model was satisfactory, right. You see the NSE, we will talk a little bit about NSE in the afternoon's class. In general, it had a reasonably good performance except for this period, right, and there was some mismatch with the rainfall and the stream flow, where we were not getting a good during 2016 to 17. But in general, your model performed. We had all 4 models performing reasonably well, right, with a reasonable accuracy. Now, using that model, we try to analyze the climate change impacts and land use change. What we realized is, although initially, historically, in the first 2 decades, the component of change in stream flow was more from the land use. As we were coming to the present, the impact was more or less similar, that the climate change was equally contributing to the changes in stream flow as compared to your land use change. Okay. So, it was, although initially it was primarily driven by the land use changes, the changes in your hydrology, in the recent times we have more of a equal contribution of climate and land use change to the changes in your hydrology or stream flow. We have not looked at other components such as ET, groundwater recharge, right. We stopped with the stream flow alone. So, to summarize what we have learnt, water and ecosystem interactions are important. It creates a feedback between hydrological cycle and the ecosystems. The changes in your vegetation, changes in your stream flow, all of them do have an effect on each other. So, your LULC changes, including forest conversion to plantation and another urbanization, lead to altered runoff patterns, decreased ET, demonstrating human activities disrupting the natural hydrological cycle. But at the same time, your afforestation also, or changes in your cropping pattern, changing from a dry land agriculture to a more water intensive crops, will increase the ET, creating also disrupting the hydrological cycle. Combined impacts of LULC changes and climate changes reveal that vegetation changes affect local water yield and runoff. climate changes exerts a more significant influence on ET and overall water availability. And the physical process linkage between climate variables and the sector of interest must be considered during the analysis. Okay, so if you have any questions, we can take now. Yes, Saradna.